By October 1944, the war had irrevocably changed course. The Wehrmacht was retreating, and the Red Army's machine was advancing relentlessly from the east. Following Operation Bagration, which had shattered German lines in Belarus, Soviet troops reached the borders of the Reich. The Soviet High Command, eager to present Stalin with a victory for the anniversary of the October Revolution, launched an offensive on East Prussia. It was in this context that, on October 21st, the village of Nemmersdorf, a strategic enclave thanks to its bridge over the Angarap River, was exposed to the advance of the Soviet 25th Tank Brigade. The first Red Madness. Convoys of civilians evacuating the villages east of the river, along with retreating German military vehicles, crowded the only passable route. The order had been given to mine the bridge, but it was not destroyed. According to some sources, the priority was to avoid civilian casualties while still crossing. This decision allowed Soviet tanks to break through at dawn on the 21st, pushing through a crowd of wagons and refugees. The Polish prisoners forced to drive many of these wagons immediately deserted and joined the Red Army troops. By 8 a.m., Nemmersdorf had fallen. Most of its 637 inhabitants had already fled. Only the elderly, the sick, and those without transportation remained behind. They were joined by straggling refugees and a few civilians still in hiding. The fighting died down by midday, and then the atrocities began. Reconstructing what happened is difficult. Eyewitness accounts are scarce and mostly collected years later. But what they describe is consistent in its horror. A group of 14 people, including Gerda Mexulat, had taken refuge in a small improvised bunker south of the village. During the afternoon, Soviet soldiers appeared at the entrance. They spoke with the adults, checked luggage, and even played with the children. Then, when a higher-ranking officer arrived, an argument broke out. The tone changed. The civilians were ordered out of the shelter. One by one, they were shot in the head. They all fell. Gerda Mexulat, seriously wounded by gunshot, survived by being covered by the bodies of others. She was found the next day by German soldiers. In another part of the village, on the estate of Mayor Johannes Grimm, a convoy of refugees attempted to set out in the morning. Shortly after leaving, they were intercepted by Soviet troops. Only the first wagon managed to escape amidst gunfire. The others were stopped, the men forced to get out, their belongings stolen. Grimm was separated from the group and executed with a shot to the temple. His wife, disguised as a Polish peasant by forced laborers, managed to survive. The village nurse was brutally beaten. Executions were not the only forms of violence. On the Esserishkin estate, 2 Soviet soldiers raped a young woman. The following day, they contemplated murdering the rest of the inhabitants, but desisted after the intervention of Polish workers. Reports indicate that during the days of the Soviet occupation of Nemmersdorf and its surroundings, not only the refugees trapped at the crossing died, but also several of those who had hidden there, and women were raped and later murdered. Some of the deaths are documented with names: the Wagner couple, Berta Ashmonite, the widow Hilgemann, among others. The parish list records at least 7 people executed in the shelter where Mexulat was located. Subsequent records collected by German authorities and witnesses, with all their limitations and possible exaggerations, agree on a pattern of violence that was neither accidental nor isolated. The Nemmersdorf massacre was not only the first documented mass crime against German civilians by the Red Army on Reich territory. It was a warning of what was to come, and what, in fact, came. In the weeks leading up to the Red Army's entry into the Third Reich, the atmosphere among Soviet troops was charged with hatred, revenge, and an implacable desire for retaliation. This was not just a spontaneous reaction of soldiers advancing after years of war and suffering, but an attitude encouraged by the military leadership and political commissars. General Ivan Danilovich Chernyakovsky, commander of the Third Belarusian Front, had made the tone of the offensive clear: "We must show no mercy, just as they showed no mercy to us. The country of the fascists must become a desert, just as ours, which they turned into a desert." For the Soviet fighters, the march on East Prussia was not just a military campaign. It was a crusade for justice through terror. Documented accounts reveal that the drive for destruction and punishment materialized in thousands of acts of violence against the German civilian population, especially women. In places like Metgethen, a suburb of Königsberg occupied by the Red Army on January 29, 1945, and briefly retaken by the Wehrmacht, German troops encountered scenes that defied all logic. According to the testimony of Karl August Knorr, 2 young women, no more than 20 years old, were found torn to pieces, still tied by their legs to 2 tanks. They had been dragged and torn in 2. In a nearby house, nearly 70 women were found who had been systematically raped, many of them up to 70 times a day. Half of them had lost their minds. The corpses of naked women and children lay behind buildings. The children's bodies showed signs of having been bludgeoned with blunt objects. The youngest had been pierced with bayonets. Soviet writer and witness Lev Kopelev, initially convinced of the just nature of the offensive, left a record of his horror. "Why are there so many bandits among our soldiers?" he wondered. He described women and girls raped in the snow, in alleys, among ruins, civilians murdered for no reason, homes looted, destruction as blind as it was wanton. Kopelev also recalled that there was a formal order to execute soldiers who committed rapes on sight, and that some measures were taken to enforce it. But the scale of the attacks, their frequency, and their geographical spread suggest that, in practice, these directives were ignored or applied only exceptionally. The Soviet authorities fostered an ideology of absolute hatred of the enemy. Propaganda, fueled by the real horrors committed by the Nazis on Soviet soil, fostered a spirit of revenge. There was talk of a sacred duty to return pain with pain. Joachim Hoffmann, a German historian, claimed that even middle-ranking commanders issued orders encouraging collective punishment. For example, a purported document found in the Bundesarchiv has been cited, in which a battalion commander exhorted his men with the words, "Let the bloodthirsty and hated enemy drown in his own black blood." Although other historians have questioned the authenticity of these texts, the general tone of the speeches and proclamations of the period confirms that a war without mercy was being promoted, in which revenge was confused with justice. Anthony Beevor noted that Chernyakhovsky's troops were greeted with the slogan, "Soldiers, remember that you are entering the lair of the fascist beast." What followed was an unprecedented chain of sexual assaults. The hatred that had fermented for years on the frozen soil of Russia erupted on the bodies of German women, many of them teenagers, elderly women and children. In numerous villages, gang rape became common practice. In documented cases, even dying or pregnant women were abused. Some were executed afterward, others committed suicide, some survived only to go mad. The brutality was not exclusive to the Red Army. Freed forced laborers, deserters, and other irregulars also participated. But in East Prussia, the punishment was systematic. The Soviet advance made no distinction between civilians and soldiers. Women in particular became the target of symbolic violence. They were the body of the enemy, the mother of the fascists, the wife of the invader. And upon that body was unleashed the pent-up fury of millions of dead, of burned villages, of raped mothers in Ukraine, Belarus, and Leningrad. The war was returning, but now it was Germany's turn. Even opponents of the Nazi regime were drawn into this spiral. The German people, hemmed in by the Morgenthau Plan, by the demand for unconditional surrender, by the images of the Red Army crossing the border, understood there was no way out, no negotiation, no mercy, only war to the bitter end. And among the ruins, absolute fear. Fear of the future, fear of the present, and fear of the sound of tanks that from town to town brought not liberation but hell, rape, propaganda, and reality. Nazi propaganda turned Nemmersdorf into a brutal warning. It was one of the few moments amidst military collapse when Goebbels's apparatus successfully mobilized fear as an instrument of cohesion. Images of women with their legs spread and staked to barn doors, girls impaled, and men executed with a shot to the back of the head were systematically disseminated. News of the murder of 50 French prisoners of war on October 20, 1944, further reinforced the narrative of horror. When German troops momentarily regained control of the village, what they found was immediately utilized. The press, radio, and pamphlets repeated the story ad nauseum. Even outside Germany, the images and testimonies were shocking. The British government went so far as to order correspondents not to publish information about it. In a private conversation, Dr. Werner Naumann, a close associate of Goebbels, confessed to the American journalist Cornelius Ryan that the campaign had been so effective that, We had brought Berliners to a state of absolute terror. And this was no exaggeration. Stories of refugees arriving from East Prussia, letters and rumors created an atmosphere of paralyzing fear. In neighborhoods like Pankow, more than 200 suicides were recorded. Entire families preferred to die together rather than fall alive into the hands of the Red Army. For thousands of Germans, the only hope was to surrender to the British or the Americans, advancing from the west. But in the east, only silence, winter, and fear awaited. Goebbels, in his diary of March 2, 1945, wrote with a mixture of alarm and propaganda calculation, "Before me is an order from Marshal Konev to his troops. Konev denounces the looting and abuses committed in the eastern German zones. He speaks of soldiers stealing vodka supplies, getting drunk until they collapse, dressing in civilian clothes, and fleeing on bicycles toward the east. He denounces fires, looting, and demands exemplary punishments. His language is revealing. For him, Soviet soldiers are steppe scum." Goebbels considered this order to confirm what the propaganda had been denouncing, a system of systematic violence. The minister himself referred to the testimonies of women in Upper Silesia. In entire villages, women between the ages of 10 and 70 were raped en masse. There is an organization to this, as if coming from above. The German High Command then planned a press campaign that would include the public reading of Soviet orders, such as Zhukov's, and the testimony of repatriated officers from Poznan who claimed to have witnessed atrocities. This campaign was effective. It multiplied panic and despair. But the rapes were not just propaganda, they were a palpable and widespread reality. Historian Alfred de Zayas collected accounts of mass murder and rape by Soviet troops in Nemmersdorf, Gumbinnen, Goldap, and Metgethen. Anthony Beaver, in his research, described columns of refugees being crushed by tanks, bombed from the air, or intercepted and executed. Women were routinely raped and left to die. In the village of Treuenbrietzen, on the 1st of May 1945, at least 88 men were arrested and shot by Soviet soldiers after the death of a Red Army officer during celebrations. Some accounts claim the true number was over 1,000 civilians. On the same day, mass rapes of local women were reported. Hannah Schissler documented the testimonies of 8-year-old girls raped after the fall of Berlin. Beaver estimated that some 100,000 women were raped in the German capital in the first days after the Soviet occupation. These figures are not arbitrary. They derive from medical estimates, hospital reports, and experiences recorded in diaries and letters. Children, adolescents, elderly women, pregnant women, nuns, widows, no condition offered protection. Some were gang raped in shifts for hours or days. Sometimes they were murdered afterward, sometimes they survived but remained forever silent. Russian historians, such as Oleg Ruzhishevsky, criticized Beaver for lacking specific documentation. They criticized her use of indirect sources and personal accounts, but evidence is not lacking. There are Soviet military reports, medical reports, archives from field hospitals, and statements made to occupation authorities. Even Red Army soldiers, such as Lev Kopelev, confessed their horror at what they saw. Orders to punish rape did exist. In the summer of 1945, cases began to be tried, some with death sentences. But the rapes continued at least until 1947, when the Soviet authorities withdrew their troops to camps isolated from civilian contact. In some towns in the Soviet occupation zone, children played at being raped by Russian soldiers. It was their way of digesting what they had seen, sometimes what they had experienced. In Lichtenberg, the first mayor claimed that the inhabitants preferred the Russian occupation to the British or American. Such was the level of plunder, arbitrariness, and humiliation that the other troops also brought. Because sexual violence was not exclusive to the Red Army, hundreds of American soldiers were tried. In March 1945 alone, 128 were brought before military tribunals for rape. In total, 70 were executed in Europe for crimes such as murder and rape. In France, civilian authorities reported repeated complaints of sexual assault. Patton himself tried to downplay these cases, justifying them or transferring problematic units. But Time magazine acknowledged in September 1945, "Our soldiers also robbed and raped. They also call us an army of rapists." The account of Nat Frenkel, a veteran of Patton's 4th Armored Division, portrayed the American soldier as having about 25 sexual encounters throughout the campaign, some consensual, others not. Frenkel justified the assaults by saying that the German women hadn't had sexual contact in a long time and wanted it. This was a way of denying the violence. In practice, many women complied out of fear, hunger, or a need for protection. Those who resisted could end up beaten, humiliated, or killed. Historian Jeffrey Birds describes a ritual dimension to the rapes committed by Soviet soldiers. They sought to impregnate German women as a symbolic form of revenge. The child of a Russian man in the womb of a German woman was a victory over the master race, an act of irreversible humiliation. Some accounts collected by Birds mention women nailed to stables with their legs spread. These weren't just rapes. They were messages, warnings, collective punishments. The first Belarusian Front's own prosecutor's office reported that many acts of looting and abuse were the work not of Soviet soldiers but of returnees, Italians, Dutch, liberated prisoners, even Germans in disguise. But the red uniform was the one that dominated. It was the one seen in the nightmare of every girl in Königsberg, every mother in Breslau, every old woman in Danzig. The Red Army, after years of suffering and destruction, became for German civilians a brutal mirror of what their own soldiers had done in the East. No trial, no forgiveness. The Russians and their atrocities. Not everyone could remain silent. Some wrote many years later, their throats still tight from what they saw. They didn't speak of rumors or propaganda. They didn't repeat what the Nazis said or what civilians feared. They spoke of what they saw with their own eyes. G.S. Kaplan, a member of the Red Army, wrote in his memoirs that during the campaign in East Prussia, he had seen the bodies of dead and raped German women. He didn't know who had killed them or who had abused them, but there they were, and at the same time he swore that no one in his unit had committed any crimes. Contradiction was a form of defense. The need to continue believing that at least around one person there was still a shred of dignity left. Lev Kopelev couldn't hold on to that consolation. He openly denounced the abuses he witnessed. He spoke of terrified women, of looting, of an unbridled hatred that knew no bounds. Not only was he not heard, but he was punished. He was expelled from the Communist Party for bourgeois humanism and compassion for the enemy. He was arrested. He was accused of treason for helping German civilians. His voice was silenced, but what he said remained, one of the few lucid confessions written from within in real time by a man who wanted to remain human in the midst of collapse. Leonid Rabichov, a signals officer, didn't need metaphors. He wrote what he saw on an East Prussian road, women lying in the snow, some with their daughters, Soviet soldiers lined up, laughing with their pants down, taking turns raping them. Those who were bleeding or losing consciousness were dragged to one side. Children who tried to intervene were shot in the face. The officers didn't stop them. On the contrary, some regulated order, others joined at the end of the line. Rabichov described the colonel, who, after observing the scene for a few minutes, unbuttoned his fly and took his place. Behind that human column, among rags, broken suitcases, and overturned carts, lay the bodies. Little girls, mothers, old people, open, naked, nameless bodies. The next day, according to Rabichov, Marshal Ivan Konev ordered the execution of 40 soldiers and officers in front of the troops. This was an attempt to restore control. In Silesia, the mass killings were not repeated since then, but in other sectors of the front, the violence continued at an autonomous pace without command or law. Mikhail Koryakov, a war correspondent for the First Ukrainian Front, recounted how he spent an entire night listening to the screams of women and children from the roof. The local elders begged him not to go up. Anyone who tried to intervene would be killed. That same night, a Soviet officer was killed by his own men while trying to stop a rape. At dawn, a young woman revealed to Koryakov through tears that she had been raped by more than 250 men in 3 weeks. So had her mother, her elderly neighbor, and a blind woman, without interruption, without rest, without hope. Grigory Pomerantz, another correspondent and essayist, left one of the most brutal chronicles. He spoke of orgies of sexual violence committed in Berlin with complete impunity. In one of the most disturbing episodes, he described how a group of soldiers raped a 60-year-old woman and then shoved a glass bottle into her vagina. When Pomerantz brought a drunken sergeant accused of attempting to rape a woman before counterintelligence, the officers let him sleep it off and returned him to his unit at dawn without any punishment. Another officer, a lieutenant, discovered a German film actress in a shelter. He not only systematically raped her but also invited other comrades to do the same. The woman appealed for help to Pomerantz's superior officer, who barely managed to issue a moral warning that had no effect. Days later, the actress took her own life. According to Pomerantz, Stalin had even sent a direct message to all communist officers and militants demanding an end to the violence. He said that the brutal treatment of the Germans only encouraged their resistance. But according to the testimony, no one paid any attention. The idea that had taken hold of the army was stronger than any order. German women were seen as booty, as legitimate trophies of the victor. As the weeks passed, the intensity of the rapes began to diminish, not so much out of conviction, but because desire had been exhausted and the commanders began to punish. For raping a German woman, 5 years in prison. For raping a Czech woman, 10. Nikolai Nikolin recounted how a Soviet soldier, whom he had reprimanded for stealing, took revenge by telephoning him the screams of girls raped by his unit. They locked the parents in a basement, and then, one by one, the soldiers raped the underage daughters. Days later, an acquaintance of Nikolin's committed suicide by jumping out of a window after being raped by 6 tankmen. Gabriela Kupp, who later became a physics professor, published her memoirs under the title Warum war ich bloß ein Mädchen? Why did I have to be born a girl? She recounted how in January 1945, at just 15 years old, she was repeatedly raped by Red Army soldiers. Her story is one among tens of thousands, but she had the strength to break the silence. Kopp survived, wrote and testified, but most never spoke. These stories are not statistics. They are open wounds. None of them come from Nazi authors or post-war propaganda. They are the voices of witnesses, of soldiers, of victims. There are no ideological discourses, only an attempt to put into words what happened. The war, in its final days, became more than a military campaign. It was a moral dissolution. And on the bodies of those German women, the defeat of all civilization was inscribed in blood and fear. The Soviets react to the atrocities. Within the Red Army, the official reaction to the crimes committed against German civilians was as ambiguous as it was fragmented. The orders existed. There were formal directives, warnings, even summary executions. But the events overwhelmed them. Between the unbridled brutality of the first days of occupation and the subsequent attempts to impose order, a chasm opened up in which thousands of women were raped, hundreds of families destroyed, and the line between justice and revenge was forever blurred. The testimonies of veterans, many of them collected decades later by historians, agree on one basic certainty: the rapes were known, discussed, even expected. But at the same time, reactions varied. Some commanders turned a blind eye, others ordered immediate executions. A few spoke of humanity, while others encouraged fury as if it were tactical fuel. Discipline, which had been the emblem of the Red Army during the years of defense, began to erode when the war crossed the Reich border, and the humiliation accumulated over 4 years was transformed into the right to punish. In Silesia, for example, Marshal Ivan Konev reacted to the outbreak of sexual violence with drastic measures. According to some witnesses, he ordered the immediate execution of 40 soldiers and officers involved in rape and looting. The execution was public, deliberate, and sought to re-establish moral control among the troops through terror. From then on, it is claimed in that region at least, mass rapes were no longer reported. But the impact of this decision did not extend beyond the immediate front. In East Prussia, Pomerania, and Brandenburg, the violence continued unabated. In the weeks leading up to the capture of Berlin, the High Command issued explicit orders for troops to respect civilians. Captain Anatoly Muzhikov recalled that senior commanders distributed clear directives demanding loyal and disciplined treatment of the German population. Looting, executions without trial, and any sexual abuse were prohibited. And in theory, these orders were followed, but on the ground, reality didn't match the paper. Commanders could issue instructions, but they were far from capable of controlling tens of thousands of soldiers, many of them without direct supervision, armed, exhausted, and raised in hatred. Some high-ranking officers maintained that the Red Army had acted with honor. General Mahmoud Gariv, president of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences, claimed that abuses did exist but were not widespread. He asserted that a military command post was established in each occupied town, tasked with protecting the population, distributing food, ensuring medical care, and maintaining order. According to his account, the crimes were rare and punished. But this assertion clashes with the volume of testimony, with post-war German medical reports, and with the silence that shrouded the issue for decades in the Soviet Union itself. Command posts did exist, yes, but in many cases they were unable to impose authority or arrived too late. Stalin, as reported by correspondent Grigory Pomerantz, even sent a personal message to all party officers and militants, urging them to treat the defeated population humanely. "Our brutal treatment drives the Germans to keep fighting," the supposed letter read. "We must stop the rape and abuse." But the message fell on deaf ears. As Pomerantz wrote, no one paid attention, neither the officers nor the communists. The idea that German women were war spoils was deeply rooted. It hadn't sprung up in a vacuum. It had been cultivated for years, fueled by propaganda, hardened by death and loss. There were attempts, even sincere ones, at punishment. Some military tribunals issued convictions. In Berlin, at the end of the fighting, rape cases began to be filed. Sentences ranged from 5 to 10 years in prison, depending on the victim's nationality, but the trials were slow, limited, and often symbolic. By then, most of the crimes had already been committed, and in many cases the perpetrators had disappeared amid the massive influx of troops or were protected by superiors who preferred to look the other way. The initial impunity generated a devastating logic. If no one punished, then it was possible, and if it was possible, then it was legitimate. The logic of the victor, as old as war itself, prevailed with renewed violence. Even so, there were soldiers who resisted. Some protected German families, others helped women escape, but they were the exception, and many remained silent. They didn't want to tarnish the victory. They didn't want to return to the night. Ilya himself, Ehrenberg, the writer and propagandist whose pen had ignited hatred during the years of resistance, began to qualify his rhetoric in 1945. Instead of calling for extermination, he wrote, "Only we must not relax, only we must not forget." Others, like the writer V.S. Bushin, noted in their diaries that children were no longer being killed, that the soldiers had mellowed out, that the crimes were isolated. In his unit, he said, he had only seen the corpse of a child once, but his testimony, though sincere, did not reflect the whole picture. As he himself wrote, the experience depended on the place, the commander, and the moment. The war was not the same for everyone. Some officers, seeing the chaos, tried to justify the unjustifiable. They argued that after years of Nazi atrocities on Soviet soil, it was impossible to curb the desire for revenge. That the men had lost their families, that they had seen their villages burn, that it was unrealistic to ask them for mercy now. But that justification failed to explain why young girls, elderly women, and pregnant women were raped. It didn't explain the laughter, the contempt, the complicity. It didn't explain why some, even without having suffered personal loss, gladly joined in the crime. The Red Army won the war. It saved Europe from Nazism. Its victory was legitimate, but that triumph also included shadows. Orders seeking to prevent abuse existed, but they couldn't stem the tide. There were punishments, but they weren't enough. There were examples of humanity, but they were devoured by the masses. The institution didn't collapse, but at times it lost its soul. And what happened to the bodies of thousands of German women wasn't an inevitable excess, but a sign that even the army of liberators could be corrupted when revenge was mistaken for justice, and for decades no one spoke about it, because silence is also part of victory. The witnesses who were not Russian. Not all witnesses to the horror spoke Russian. Some arrived from the other side of the front, notebooks in their pockets and cameras hanging from their necks, seeking to understand what kind of world the war had left behind. It was British, American, and Australian war correspondents who were the first to record from within the echoes of the German collapse and the devastating march of the Red Army. They were neither propagandists nor soldiers. They observed, they noted, they listened. And what they found in Berlin and Eastern Germany was not just ruin, but fear. A fear that spoke in whispers, in lowered gazes, in women who refused to remember what had been done to them as Soviet tanks advanced through the broken avenues. One of the most lucid was Osmar White, an Australian correspondent throughout the war. His diary, later published as The Road to Victory, is an ambiguous and human testimony, where gratitude toward the Soviets for their contribution to the defeat of Nazism coexists with a bitter understanding of what had happened in Germany. White did not directly witness rapes, but spoke with dozens of Berliners in the weeks following the surrender. The phrase most often repeated in these conversations was always the same: "Thank God you came. The Russians are animals." White, however, tried to maintain his distance. He knew that the Nazi machine had been adept at creating images of horror to manipulate the population. He also knew that the narrative of the barbarian from the East had been sown for years. But what he heard over and over again on the streets of Berlin, in the rubble-strewn courtyards and cellars where women scarred by fear were hiding, was not fabrications. So many broken looks could not be faked. The anti-Russian hysteria was so strong that the Allied authorities feared it would fuel political divisions among the victors. The head of the Anglo-American press office gathered all the accredited journalists and gave them a clear warning. Do not believe unverified German stories about Soviet atrocities. The Germans seek to divide us. But those stories were there, and they didn't come just from Nazis. White interviewed a middle-aged German woman who lived in a building with 7 others. She wasn't raped. She spoke a little Russian, and when a drunken Soviet soldier tried to force himself on her, she stopped him by speaking firmly. She told him he was dishonoring his country. He stopped, but then he took all her clothes. He returned in the morning, ashamed, with a bag of food. It was a clumsy gesture of reparation. The woman accepted the food. She said nothing more. But she also told how one of her friends was raped in front of her, and how a neighbor was killed for carrying what looked like a revolver in her pocket. Allied soldiers also heard the stories. Some believed them, others didn't. The contrast between Soviet treatment and that of British or American troops was a common theme among civilians. For many German women, the only way out was to cross the Elbe before the Red Army tanks did. Those left behind buried their daughters under straw, dressed them up as boys, or made them sleep in sealed cellars. It was the only way to try to escape a fate everyone knew, but no one could name out loud. The weight of these stories was so great that even within the Western High Command there was concern. The image of the Soviet ally had to be protected in a context where unity among the victorious powers was still necessary. Publicly admitting that the Red Army had sexually devastated entire regions of Germany opened a political wound that was impossible to heal. Therefore, for months, reports of sexual violence were filed away, silenced, or downplayed. Time magazine in September 1945 was one of the few to break the taboo. Our troops have also robbed and raped. They also call us the army of rapists. It was a belated but significant admission. If even Western troops in their relative restraint had crossed boundaries, what could be said about what an army swept away by the propaganda of total revenge had done? The differences were not merely perceptual. The sexual violence perpetrated by Red Army soldiers had a symbolic dimension that escaped the logic of opportunity or plunder. For many observers, even Allied soldiers, the rapes committed by Soviets in Germany had something ritualistic about them, like corporal punishment inflicted on an enemy people through their women. This was a war waged with the body, an invasion that did not stop at territorial conquest, but penetrated to the very core of defeated society. German women were no longer a military target. They were tools to humiliate, subjugate, and disfigure the memory of the Reich. In this context, the perception of German civilians became uniform. They no longer distinguished between the frontline soldier and the liberator. The Soviet uniform symbolized fear. Many women, even those who sympathized with communism or had been opponents of Nazism, fell into the same category, the defeated. The army that claimed to bring historical justice came with the same brutality as the imperial armies of the past. It came to seize, to destroy, to brand with fire. For years, silence was the only possible response. Women didn't speak. Families hid what had happened. Military archives were closed. Even within the Western Bloc, the subject was avoided. It wasn't convenient. It wasn't useful. It was too dirty. But the memory persisted. In diaries, in letters, in the veiled statements of those who wanted to bear witness without their trembling being noticeable. In the spontaneous confessions of old Russian soldiers who, their voices broken by age, admitted what they had seen and sometimes what they had done during the days of victory. Because victory didn't resemble glory. For many civilians, it was simply an extension of hell. And of all hells, the most intimate was the one that left no visible scars, but marked entire generations with the certainty that no one, not even the victors, is safe from the moral mud of war. The Americans also raped. Liberation wasn't always a celebration. In Normandy, Provence, and Brittany, many women discovered that the liberator's uniform could also carry the shadow of a rapist. The rapes committed by American soldiers on French soil weren't as systematic or massive as those that would later occur in East Germany, but they did exist. They are recorded. And although for decades they were covered by a cloak of silence, out of gratitude, out of political necessity, out of shame, they left deep scars in small villages, in military tribunals, in archives that no one wanted to open for years. These weren't rumors. There were formal complaints, trials, and convictions. The US Army maintained mobile courts-martial that tried hundreds of soldiers for crimes against the French civilian population. Between June and December 1944 alone, at least 208 American soldiers were tried for rape in France. Most of them were African American soldiers, a fact that reveals both the violence perpetrated and the structural racism within the military. Whites were rarely tried, and even more rarely convicted. In the Le Mans region, in August 1944, a 17-year-old girl was raped by 3 American soldiers while walking home at dusk. Her parents reported the crime to the military authorities, and the soldiers were arrested. The trial was swift. 2 were sentenced to death, the third to life imprisonment. Court records show that the victim's testimony was considered solid and coherent, although under other circumstances these attributes were not enough to secure justice. The trial was, in part, a response to the local scandal, the outrage that swept through the town, and pressure from the mayor and the priest who intervened in the girl's defense. Similar cases were repeated in rural areas. In the Calvados department, a 40-year-old woman was raped by 2 soldiers in a barn while her young son cried, locked in the chicken coop. In Corentin, a teenage girl was approached by a drunken soldier in a cul-de-sac. No one heard her scream. She was found the next day, bleeding, her dress torn. The soldier was identified and tried. He was executed by order of the military tribunal. But others were not so lucky. In many villages, the attacks were denied or disguised as misunderstandings. Some victims did not report out of shame or fear. Others were pressured by their families to remain silent. In a newly liberated society, still celebrating the fall of the German occupiers, claiming that the liberator had raped was a form of betrayal. In some cases, the abusers were simply transferred to other units before the complaint could be filed. In others, money or rations were offered in exchange for silence. The figure of the soldier liberator had been carefully constructed by Allied propaganda. Images of girls with flowers and women kissing soldiers on balconies were part of the narrative. Talking about rape was breaking that script. But in cities like Cherbourg, Saint-Lô, and Rennes, French gendarmerie records show a notable increase in reports of sexual assault after the arrival of Allied troops. The reports were passed on to the US military command, which responded with selective investigations. The criterion was not only the veracity of the incident, but also its political impact. Racism within the military also shaped the way justice was administered. Of the American soldiers sentenced to death for rape in Europe, more than 85% were African American, despite representing a minority within the deployed forces. Historian Mary Louise Roberts has documented how this disproportionate proportion revealed not only a desire to discipline, but also a way of maintaining the honor of the White Army at the expense of its black soldiers. In several cases, rapes committed by white soldiers were treated as inappropriate relationships or cultural misunderstandings, while those of African American soldiers were judged with exemplary harshness. In the Chartres region, a young mother was attacked while collecting water from the village well. The attacker was identified as a white soldier from an artillery unit. The case never went to trial. The soldier was sent to England under the pretext of psychological problems. The victim, according to medical records, became pregnant. Her son was born in the spring of 1945. The village never spoke of the matter. The family moved to another department. In Marseille, where Allied troops landed in August 1944 as part of Operation Dragoon, the situation was particularly tense. In the port areas, rape cases were compounded by rising prostitution, the black market, and racial conflicts. French authorities filed more than 50 formal rape complaints between September and November alone. In some cases, soldiers were accused of attacking women working in canteens or field kitchens. In others, they were accused of breaking into homes at night. The archives show that many victims were single women, peasants, war widows, and teenagers. Some accepted rations of chocolate or cigarettes as a form of protection. It was a fine line between forced consent and disguised violence. For many, silence was the only possible solution. There was no shortage of attempts at public denunciation. Anonymous letters were published in some regional newspapers speaking of abuses committed by our supposed saviors. Some parishes warned from the pulpit that freedom cannot be built on the humiliated bodies of our women. But Allied censorship, combined with the patriotic fervor of the liberation, quickly silenced any criticism. France needed to rebuild itself, and the United States was its main supporter. Denouncing American soldiers was frowned upon. It was dangerous. It was simply unthinkable. As time passed, some crimes came to light. The memoirs of elderly victims, the testimonies collected by historians, and the declassified archives of military tribunals began to paint a parallel story. The story of sexual violence committed in the name of victory. A story without monuments, without plaques, without official dates. Because war doesn't just leave graves, it also leaves silences. And in those silences, in the villages of inland France where memories are passed down from mother to daughter, women still remember that the Allied uniform can also weigh like a curse. Italy was the first Western theatre where Allied soldiers set foot on continental Europe. For many, liberation began there, amid bombed-out fields, stone villages, and women waving white scarves. But for others, the arrival of star-spangled uniforms brought not freedom, but a new form of subjugation. The rapes committed by American soldiers during the Italian campaign from 1943 onward were more numerous than anyone cared to admit. Although the cases were partly documented by the American military tribunals themselves, the story remained trapped for decades in shame, omission, and class contempt. Unlike France, where state structures still functioned with some regularity, Italy was devastated. Politically fragmented, socially vulnerable, institutionally absent in many regions. The Allied campaign advanced slowly, and behind the front lines, entire villages were isolated, defenseless, lawless. It was in this vacuum that sexual assault flourished. According to declassified U.S. Army files, at least 2,000 cases of rape were committed by American soldiers in Italy, although historians agree that the actual number was much higher. One of the most emblematic cases took place in the Lazio region, in a small southern village called Santa Maria Infante, during the spring of 1944. After the German withdrawal, a patrol of American soldiers entered the village and settled in several abandoned houses. According to testimony from residents, a group of 5 soldiers entered the home of a widow with 3 daughters at night. They beat them, raped them, and abandoned the house at dawn. The local priest wrote a desperate letter to the Bishop of Gaeta, who in turn attempted to contact the Allied commander of the sector. The case was never formally investigated. The military archives of the Third Army record another case in Naples in November 1943, when a 16-year-old girl was raped by a soldier while on her way to the market. The incident was witnessed by 2 neighbors who identified the attacker. He was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 20 years in prison. But this punishment was the exception. In most cases, especially when the victims were poor, illiterate, or rural women, the institutional response was silence. In Campania, the area between Caserta and Benevento was particularly affected. Women, many of them alone after the men were mobilized, were left exposed. Soldiers settled in houses requisitioned by the army, often demanding hospitality in exchange for cigarettes, canned meat, or protection. Consent was a fiction. Many of these women complied out of fear, hunger, or to protect their daughters. It was a form of informal slavery, legitimized by the total asymmetry of power. In some regions, such as Abruzzo and Molise, the situation was even more dire. Communication lines were cut, and many villages were isolated for weeks. American soldiers patrolling the rural areas moved freely. In several villages, cases were reported of soldiers demanding female escorts from the local mayors to maintain security. The designated women were peasants, laundresses, and even children. Some families fled to the mountains, others hid their daughters in cellars for weeks. A particularly brutal incident occurred in the city of Latina in June 1944, when a group of soldiers broke into a convent. 3 nuns were raped, one of whom bled to death. The church formally protested to the Allied command, but the incident was classified as a closed incident after an internal investigation. Witnesses, other nuns, a doctor and a neighbor, were not called to testify. The silence was enforced as part of a strategy to maintain the troops' morale. Most of the soldiers tried for rape in Italy belonged to segregated units of the US Army. In fact, more than 80% of the soldiers convicted of sexual crimes were African American, although they represented less than 10% of the deployed forces. This disproportionate proportion reveals a double violence against Italian women and against black soldiers themselves, used as scapegoats to maintain the image of the white liberator. Several studies have shown that white soldiers were rarely investigated and even more rarely convicted, even though testimony often directly implicated them. In many cases, the community itself tried to punish the guilty when justice failed. In one Umbrian village, a soldier was lynched by the family of a raped young woman. The army responded by arresting the village men and threatening reprisals. Only the intervention of the parish priest prevented a massacre. Relations between the Italian civilian population and the Allied forces were marked by silent resentment, a tension that persisted even after the war. Reports from the International Red Cross and some ecclesiastical missions privately documented this violence. They spoke of acts of indiscipline and excesses, but the documents were not sent to the press. The women affected were rendered invisible. No one wanted the victory to be tainted by the tears of an Italian peasant woman. The dominant narrative called for heroes, not criminals. And yet the voices continued. In 1995, a woman named Maria Carmela Di Fazio, who had been raped in 1944 by 2 American soldiers in a cornfield near Avellino, gave public testimony in a radio interview. She recounted how her family forced her to remain silent, how she was sent to Naples to serve in the home of a distant relative, and how her son was born and died nameless. She said, "I was raped for being poor, for being alone, for having no one in uniform to defend me." She was the first of many who began to speak out when they no longer had anything to lose. In the following years, several Italian municipalities organized silent commemorations in memory of women victims of wartime abuse. There were no plaques, no monuments, no official ceremonies, only masses, offerings, whispered names. Because in Italy, as throughout Europe, the history of the war was not only written with bullets and flags, it was also written on women's bodies, in their silences, in their nameless nights.